Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the fifth lecture of the webinar series entitled Towards Critical, Historical, and Transnational Dialogues on Japanese Model of Education. My name is Keita Takayama. I'm a professor and a director for the Global Education Office, which sits within the Graduate School of Education at Kyoto University. Today, we are hosting a talk by Professor Youl-Kwan Sung from Kyung Hee University, South Korea. I'm going to formally introduce Professor Sung later in the introduction, but for now, let me try to situate today's talk within the series of lectures that we have hosted up to this point. We have so far hosted 4 lectures, with the very first talk in late July. That was when we kickstarted the webinar. We have had 1 American and 3 Japanese speakers, 1 literacy theorist / practitioner, and 3 historians who all look to the past as far back to the pre-war period, the 1920s and 30s, and then to the 1950s and 60s. The first speaker, Dr. Mira Shimabukuro from University of Washington, talked about diary writings of Japanese Americans during the wartime internment / concentration camp, with a focus on the rhetorical use of gaman and its implications for the subsequent redress movement in the 1980s. The second lecture by Professor Sato Manabu of the National Museum of Japanese History examined the Japanese colonial education in Taiwan and Korea, with a particular focus on its continuities and discontinuities, and before and after Japan's war defeat in 1945. The third speaker, Professor Takeshi Komagome, my colleague at the KyotoU here, took us to the post-war period, post-war Japan, to the 1950s and 60s, whereby a group of individuals associated with one publisher in Tokyo were trying to internationalize a unique writing pedagogy called seikatsu tsuzurikata, or daily life writing. Professor Komagome's illustration of the kind of challenges that they had to address in order to get the international collaborators to understand what the daily life writing was all about gave us a glimpse into some of the unique features of its pedagogic ethos. And the last speaker we had back in October, Dr. Sachio Negawa of the International Research Institute of Japanese Culture. It took us back to the pre-war and wartime period, whereby Japanese schools in Brazil were producing imperial subjects on the other side of the planet, while at the same time being shaped by the nationalizing effort of Brazil at the time. So for the last 4 months or so, we have been sort of moving back and forth in time, like a time traveler, from the pre-war, wartime to post-war, and then back to pre-war, while exploring the historical continuities and discontinuities of the Japanese education practice and system. And from today's talk onward, however, we're leaving behind the distant past to talk about more contemporary cases of transnational movements of Japanese educational ideas and practices. We have chosen Professor Sung to kickstart our look into the contemporary cases of Japanese education's international transfers. I won't say too much at this point about his talk. I don't want to spoil it, but it will touch upon Manabu Sato's theory of learning community, Manabi no Kyodoutai. More specifically, how that notion has been embraced by a group of progressive educators in Seoul. In fact, Manabu Sato's work has been extremely influential, both in and outside Japan, often adopted by grassroots school reform efforts in Asia. Arguably, Manabu Sato is one of few theorists of pedagogy in Japan who has been deeply connected to the work of teachers and a bottom-up school reform effort. And he is very politically active, as many of us in Japan would know. Unfortunately, his international influence and legacy are not well recognized within Japan, so we very much look forward to learning from Professor Sun's talk today. I have known Professor Sun for nearly 15 years, since we were together doing a PhD degree at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, United States. He was 2 to 3 years ahead of me. After completing his degree, he went back to Korea while I ended up going to Australia. Fast forwarding the clock to about 8 years ago, Professor Sun invited me to give a talk at the Korean Curriculum Association's meeting, as well as Korean Teachers Union's Seoul City Branches gathering. It was at these meetings, but especially at the latter's, the Teachers Union's gathering, that I witnessed his impressive leadership skills. At the union gathering, he not only served as the MC, gave a talk, and translated my talk, but also performed his own songs in front of the big audience. I quickly learned that it wasn't the first time he was singing for them. It was clear to me that the audience had known about his music talent and enthusiastically embraced his singing. And indeed, his singing was exceptional. I had no doubt that was the most memorable and the most popular part of the gathering. Definitely not my talk. Several years after my visit to Korea, I had the pleasure of hosting his family in Australia during his sabbatical leave. Professor Sun is a former dean of the Graduate School of Education at Kyung Hee University in Seoul. He earned PhD in Wisconsin in critical curriculum studies. He's well published in Korea with his latest book published in 2018 titled Students Asleep in the Class, The Perspectives from Sociology of Curriculum. Was selected by the Ministry of Education for its highly commended list of books for that year, 2018. Professor Sun has also published numerous articles in English, which appeared in top international journals, including Comparative Education, Curriculum Inquiry, and Oxford Review of Education. Beyond academia, Professor Sun is very politically active, getting deeply involved with the Teachers Union, an alternative school reform movement that he's going to talk about today, and also serving as the education advisor for the city of Seoul. It is an absolute honor to host his talk today, and please welcome Professor Sun.
Thank you, Keita, for introducing, and you share a long time to explain who I am, and also I really thanks compliment for the music. Actually, I writing a song which is related to education, life, and society. So, but now today, we'll talk more about education and the pedagogy. I'm honored to have the opportunity to give a lecture today and discuss my research topic with educators in Japan and South Korea. Today, I will look at the discourses on the school reform in Korea and Japan to examine how we understand East Asian style of education and how communitarian approach to school reform are used to overcome it. In particular, I will bring my lecture today focusing on how teachers in South Korea called the South Korean Innovative School, called the Hyukshin Schools, refers to Professor Sato Manabu's community of learning. Before I begin my presentation, I would like to mention that this presentation is based on the study currently being conducted with my co-author. She is Professor Yumi Lee, who is standing to speak at the seminar with the teachers in this picture. And we did a lot of research on Hyukshin schools and educational policies in global context. My presentation today will be based on these researches that has been carried out and published over the past decade. Now we look at the backgrounds of Hyukshin School movement. First of all, Hyukshin schools are on the shoulders of the true education called chamgyoyuk that Korean Teachers Union has developed. True education was a movement held in the late 1980s by progressive teachers to protest against military dictatorship and to promote social democracy, both in society and education. With great progress of democratization in Korea, the discourse on true education has decreased a lot, but the tradition of true education has led to Hyukshin School today. As I will talk about it a little bit later, with the advent of progressive superintendents in South Korea, Korean Teachers Union has led Hyukshin Schools by cooperating with the superintendents and engaging in education policies. The picture on the left above left, is one where KyotoU, Korean Teachers Union, began its organization in 1989. This instant, the first 1,500 teachers to be fired. It's very hard to believe. It was unbelievable national violence. And after democratization, they were all able to return to school. Back then, the teachers were at the front of the school democracy. Second, I'm gonna mention a little bit about the Korean Hyukshin School teachers looking at the Nordic welfare state's education. As was the case in Japan, to my knowledge, there has been a lot of interest in Finnish education in Korea. And the teachers of Hyukshin schools have referred to education in Northern European welfare states such as Denmark, Sweden, as a model for Hyukshin schools. Especially these teachers tend to assume it is important to look at relationship between education and welfare state. Professor Sato Manabu makes an interesting observation about the East Asian style education. Education in East Asia countries has been typified by high scores in international competitions, like PISA tests, etc. But a low level of student satisfaction with the education and rejection of student participation in learning. Sato terms it escaping from learning. The students in these countries are now radically escaping from learning, and their schools are having mounting problems with instruction and discipline. This is what Professor Sato Manabu have written in his book and his lectures. Among the symptoms of disease are students' lack of interest in academic affairs, despite high scores, classroom and classroom disorder, the bullying, and increasing number of student dropouts. Sato Manabu connects this dominant instructional style of whole class uniformity and the top-down administrative bureaucracy with the need for social efficacy as part of a development pattern of these countries. And he calls it compressed modernization. So he thinks this compressed modernization is closely linked to East Asian style of education. Some of you may not agree with his term East Asian style of education, but we need to talk about it, what it means to be East Asian style of education. The books on the left are representative of 2 books of the many translations of books written by Sato Manabu in South Korea. As I told you, this presentation is based on I am now analyzing data, which is collected by my co-author, Yumi Lee. We divide research questions into 3. The first one is we're gonna explore the way some Hyukshin School activists, like enthusiastic Hyukshin School teachers, make use of Sato Manabu's community of learning strategy to their practice. In today's presentation, when I talk like, the capital C of capital L learning, the community of learning, is what I meant the Sato Manabu's concept. The second, to discuss what motivated Hyukshin School teachers to refer to learning community movement of Japan. Third, we're going to discuss how teachers in Hyukshin School movement view the educational philosophy, viewpoints of pedagogy, and the strategies for school change presented by Sato Manabu. Due to the pandemic of COVID-19, we were not able to meet teachers for obtaining like interviews. So instead we asked them written interviews. So that interviews was conducted in September, like a couple of months ago, and we select 20 teachers. Many of them are also working for Hyukshin Schools, 13 high school teachers, and 7 middle school teachers. We are focusing on secondary school because Sato Manabu's community of learning have influence on the middle school rather than elementary school. And we select the teachers among teachers who have engaged in community of learning. And as a trained scholars, we analyzed the data, typical qualitative research method, like what is called initial, focused, and the theoretical coding. Okay, before jumping to the analysis, the results of analysis, I'm gonna give you some sense of Hyukshin School. I think the definition of Hyukshin School is very important. Well, there is slightly different versions of definition in different provinces, and the school's name is a little bit different, but usually we call them Hyukshin School as a whole. Hyukshin Schools refers to a role model school, role model for school innovation, creating a new school culture based on collaborative atmosphere, like a cooperative school ethos, student rights, democratic decision-making by teachers. To obtain the status of this school, there are two conditions must be satisfied. The first, if we want to get a status of Hyukshin School, more than half of teachers at your school have to agree to apply for it, and the school board must be approved this decision. Second, a school requires authorization of their proposal by province of education, but it is not that much competitive. Agreement in your school is most important. Once more than half and most of the teachers agree to do, I don't think there will be any problem to get a status. The status allows the school to receive annual subsidies and grants. And they are allowed to have autonomy, relative autonomy from the usual top-down administration. In turn, there are several requirements school must follow. Usually, we suggest three things. The first one is the promoting collaborative learning, or sometimes we call it excellence for every student. Second, listening to teachers' voice. Third, building a teachers' learning community. Please look at the infogram, the left side. This is a curriculum, classroom, like an instruction and evaluation. So this is like a very representative symbols to signify what Hyukshin School have to do. So it is very important to know there are three: the curriculum, instruction, and evaluation located at the center. This is school management, student guidance, and collaboration with the local community, and student well-being or the welfare. They are 6 basic areas and requirements for participating schools. This is also evident in the definition of Hyukshin School as a leading school that creates a responsible community of learning and caring through democratic participation and collaboration. This is a whole school approach. This school project views the entire pedagogical process as connected on the shared vision in and around the school. The curriculum, school that develop whole person and the democratic citizenship. Second, the classroom teaching, exciting schools, making exciting schools where students learn and grow together through participation and inclusion. Third, assessment, schools that assess the process of growth, development rather than competition, or like rigorous the measures based on multiple choice tests. The making of building the cooperative school culture is the fourth. Student guidance and the discipline. Peaceful schools that respect student rights and voices and prohibit corporal punishment. We do not have any corporal punishment in school now, but a decade ago, corporal punishment is things that we easily see when you visit Korean public schools. The student well-being and the cooperation with the local community is also important as one crucial element of 6 basic areas. Okay, this is two interesting graphics. Look at left side. Let's take a brief look at historical and the political backgrounds of innovative school, Hyukshin School. If there, this school is very closely related to South Korean politics, direct election system. We introduced that direct election system for superintendents in 2009. If there were no direct election system for superintendents in Korea, would there be an Hyukshin School? Well, I don't think so. In other words, the direct election of superintendents enabled the institutionalization of Hyukshin School. It's no exaggeration to say that. I want to give an emphasis on the fact that this policy is related to the introduction of direct election of superintendents, which made it possible for newly elected progressive superintendents. We call Jimbo superintendents to initiate the Hyukshin School. So please look at this graph. This is rapid growth in the number. It's quite surprising to see now 13% of who South Korean schools belong to this category, which means 13 schools, 13 schools out of 100 schools are Hyukshin schools. It's huge numbers. In 2017, the government, under the leadership of President Moon Jae-in, spread Hyukshin School across the nation. The number of these schools has increased every year. As I told you, now 13% of South Korean Hyukshin School. This rapid diffusion creates concern that integrity will be diminished, but at the same time proves its importance. So we now talking about the dilemma. We are discussing about the dilemma of expansion and the beacon effect. This graph, I just selected this infographic to get you some sense. The blue one, the progressive superintendents have been elected. There are only two exceptions or two regions. Now I want to share with you the common principles of Hyukshin School. I think it is important to review the discourses of networks for the new schools, in that this network has played a crucial role in the spread of Hyukshin Schools. This is Namhansan Elementary School, very well known as the origin of Hyukshin School. This school is located in rural area where many parents want to leave the village to look for better condition of education for their children. But this school, as a part of the networks for the small school or network for new school later, developed the initial model of school reform and got a lot of media attention for their enthusiastic practice. This group's common principle of Hyukshin School show very well the philosophy and the direction of Hyukshin School. So it is very important to know Hyukshin School was the first originated from rural area elementary school. So Hyukshin School is something that it started from bottom up leadership, but now it is institutionalized when Hyukshin School meet with progressive superintendent. So now it is a little bit top down. So it is the middle ground from the top down and bottom up. It's a very unique system of the Hyukshin School. Now, I really like to share with you that Hyukshin School has been receiving a lot of spotlight from the media, especially on TV. Of course, we could see in the media the opposition to Hyukshin School too, but there are much more broadcasts, much more media broadcasted as a hope for the future of a Korean school. I'm going to show you a video clip out of a TV documentary. There is no sound here in the Zoom, but there are a lot of information you want to get. This school is well known for its application, Sato Manabu's community of learning. This is what you're seeing in the screen. They moved to their the desks for the collaborative learning. I should be very careful to say this famous school adopted community of learning as a model of their schools, because some of the teachers in the school might want to say Hyukshin School are much more than that, much more than community of learning, because the community of learning is a part of Hyukshin School that includes many other crucial elements more than classroom teaching innovation. But I think, no doubt, the community of learning has clearly been helpful and influenced to change the culture and the real practices of school change. Changes in classroom space and the layout are also important medium. It's a very important medium for school changes in Hyukshin schools. The seating arrangement in the traditional classroom were all the desk facing the blackboard. The students were passive, staring straight at the blackboard, and the teacher without a dialogue, accepting the knowledge the teacher delivers. However, the teachers in Hyukshin School no longer use like a row seating, and instead they chose like a U-shape seating, U-shape in a lecture, and cluster seating in small group activities arrangement. This is used as a main strategy for increasing sense of classroom belongings. The seating arrangement is much more than strategy to enhance classroom, effectiveness. This is one example that the Hyukshin School is influenced by Sato Manabu. What change have Hyukshin School made in South Korean public education over the past decade? The first thing among the change is that Hyukshin School teachers wrote many books based on their successful school change experience, and made a big change in Korean publishing market. Isn't that interesting enough? Yeah, I think that this is very interesting phenomenon, because before the period of Hyukshin School, I think the professors and educational researchers, experts leading educational book markets, but Hyukshin School movement changes professional learning, how to distribute this learning, who own the knowledge. So there are a lot of changes in educational knowledge for school changes. It's very important. I really highlight this in my presentation. Second, many teachers in Hyukshin School have offered the student with activities such as sports, arts, musicals, and the clubs. Teachers emphasize the importance the students run these activities on their own leadership. If a new school is designated as a Hyukshin School, a school song and many new symbols are needed. Interestingly, the students write their own lyrics and include a spirit of a Hyukshin School. You want to look at the, above and the left, there is the lyrics and there is a school song which written by students themselves. Collaborative rule making is one of the most important features of Hyukshin School. In the process of collaborative rule making, teachers promote student voice by encouraging them to address the issues like a hairstyle, uniform, and cell phones. They have disagreements among students, teachers, and parents. So by virtue of a collaborative rule making, teachers eased their conflict with the student. Many teachers in Hyukshin School wanted to stay away from the hardship of getting into conflict with the students when using like a penalty point system as disciplinary strategies. So teacher-student relationship of trust gained by this process, and it is very helpful to encourage students to participate in learning, not to mention discipline. So the picture on this slide, there are students, the teachers, parents, the sign and the swear school regulation they collaboratively made. This is quite a common scene you can see when you're visiting Hyukshin School in South Korea. It's very interesting, very crucial element of identity building in Hyukshin Schools. Now we will see the picture on the slide. What do you think happens in this photo? A newspaper featured this article with the title of "Movie Like Farewells." Students at Hyukshin School went out to the playground while a few of them take the hands of a principal who had to leave school to another one, and went up to rooftop together. At the same time, the remaining 700 students and the teachers on the ground presented her with a huge human heart. Do you think this can happen just by letting students to do it or by asking them to do? I don't think so. I think this phenomenon is effect of Hyukshin School, which is like culture is embedded in teachers and students' mind for a long time. This is latent the curriculum, and it is it is related to being aware of physical punishment cultures. Teachers who want to improve school thought usually think it embarrassing to still have a physical punishment and the school gate inspection in industrialized country like South Korea. Enthusiastic teachers wanted to go beyond abolition of corporal punishment and inspection. They suggest to cultivate more ethical climate of school cultures. As I mentioned a little bit, this is a latent or hidden curriculum of school. Ethical ethos or environment is very important to bring up our students to the future citizens. Um, among the culture of South Korean secondary schools, there is a distinctive features called the school gate guidance. Actually, it is a school gate inspection. To my knowledge, the Japan has very similar cultures in terms of school gate inspections. Every morning, teachers of student guidance department examine each student entering school in front of a school gate. Teachers inspect students to ensure if they are following the rules and punish them if they don't in accordance with school regulation. At the school gate, the teachers check student length and the color of hair, mode of dress in school uniforms, name tag, badges, identifying whether, teachers check whether students are late for school. But the school is the place where students spend the longest hour except at home. So, but without this, the warm culture to respect the student, in every morning, when students meet with this kind of school gate inspection, it is very difficult to think students start with their learning. They're first to, start their learning in the morning. So I think the learning is strongly related to the school gate inspection. They feel the control, and they made feel, this control. School is not for them. The school is placed to control their every, hairstyle and everything about their details. Collaborative rulemaking is a key strategy in the Hyukshin School movement. It is closely related to broader social issues of the ordinance of school rights that most of progressive superintendents have implemented. So if you are really interested in Hyukshin School, you might want to the Google, or you might want to find more materials, articles on the ordinance of student right in South Korea. The Seoul Metropolitan Council in 2012 passed the ordinance that was originally developed by superintendents of Seoul Metropolitan Office of Education. It included the abolition of corporal punishment and inspection of belongings, student freedom of assembly, a ban or discrimination against homosexuals, tolerance in hairstyles, the flexibility in school dress code. However, as you might expect, this attempt to have been faced with a tremendous opposition. Then Hyukshin School, the focus on student interest and to provide many practical opportunities for them to plan and deal with these tasks for themselves. So Hyukshin School really promotes the student autonomy activities within the school curriculum and after school. It is part of such efforts. So entire student body often gather together, as you see in the picture, share opinions to experience direct democracy. This is a very typical method used in Hyukshin School, is to have all students present their opinions, usually by putting post-it on board on a given agenda, then reduce them, reduce different ideas to a few alternatives, and finally select the final decision through vote and other method. So, I think this photo on screen well representing what Hyukshin School means for. This is another interesting photos. There are many people in Korea who oppose Hyukshin School, even if they are a very effective way to reform schools. What if the parents object, especially when the education officer tries to designate a particular school as a Hyukshin School? This photo shows the parents of that school strongly opposing it, which has drawn media attention and sparked a huge debate. Hyukshin schools want better education, but the parents are against better education. What a difficult dilemma it is. I will be back to these issues later during today's discussion. Now, we have a look at South Korean Hyukshin School. I have spent relatively a long time explaining this concept to you because it would be very unfamiliar with you. Now let's look at what South Korean teachers think community of learning has affected to their practice. To find out, I with my co-author Yumi, asked 6 questions here to 20 teachers. We asked them these questions. I just wanted to what are ways that Korean Hyukshin schools are embracing and utilizing Sato Manabu's community of learning. And what do you think of Professor Sato Manabu's philosophy of education, his perspectives on students and the teachers, and the strategy of changing schools and the classroom teaching? What are similarity or difference between Hyukshin schools and the community of learning? And I asked them why you come to know community of learning and made the decision to introduce to your practice. Now I'm going to show you, the direct excerpt from the teachers from the interview data, rather than giving, a second-hand interpretation by me. I think this is a more vivid data you might want to see. As a result of analyzing the given qualitative data, we found the 3 main facts. From now on, I'm going to show you the excerpts of the interview data and explain how they perceive a community of learning. The first characteristic we draw is a philosophy, is that philosophy matters. The philosophy is very important to borrow or refer to Sato Manabu's community of learning. I'm going to read what teacher 3 said. What's great about Professor Sato is the reason he studied the community of learning was because he, whose parents are victims of the bombing, thought about how to create a society that would never go through war again. I didn't check, the Sato Manabu's parents are really victims of the bombing in Second World War. I don't think it's important. The important is the way the teachers really they knows a lot about Sato Manabu's they read a lot of books by him, written by him. So they knew the detailed knowledge of his parents are victim of the bombing, which is very important because it is related to democratic society. Sato does not want to go through war again. Japanese society should become a democratic society. And if Japanese society wants to become a democratic society, students should learn democracy as a life at school. It's a very important excerpt. The other example that shows that philosophy matters. Recently, I have often come to the idea that true learning begins in a democratic classroom. And I'm convinced that beginning of a democratic classroom can be done through careful listening. Careful listening is a very important element of Sato Manabu's communitarian learning. But more crucial thing is learning community allow us to expect to change classes, change schools, and ultimately change society. I might interpret this the reason some South Korean Hyukshin schools refer to Sato Manabu is because they think the philosophy matters, which means learning community allow us to change classes, and student learning is eventually related to change society. Second characteristics we draw is something about effectiveness. Teacher 7 said, when I first started Hyukshin School, I worked as Hyukshin manager, bucho in Japanese. I just learned from the interpreter a little bit before. Now, I have moved to new school. Here I persuade my fellow teachers, studied another Hyukshin school. When we are doing this, strategy of changing a school from classroom teaching is very effective because teachers are all interested in and want to do well in the classroom. So this approach is, quite effective approach to teachers. Though this is the way teachers really feel about, community of learning. I think this excerpt show the well about effectiveness. Teacher 13 said the advantage of a community learning is that it provides a framework for open class lesson study and the peer observation. In the community learning, when observing classes, teacher observers do not see teaching skills of teachers in class, but how well the student learn. So, as the growth of Hyukshin School, this image is very common to the Hyukshin School teachers. In the open class, the observing teachers just looking at, making observation of a student, their individual growth, how they feel, the difficulty, how they participate. Is their participation authentic? Is our student feel safe to, talk about their opinion? Is a student has a belongingness in the classroom? So I think this is the most important contribution that Sato Manabu's community of learning influenced the school innovation strategies. Third, the characteristics Yumi and I draw from the data is similarity of educational problems. I'm going to introduce teacher 19, what teacher 19 said. Secondary school teachers usually focus one-sided delivery in classes because they never take a step away from emphasizing the importance of entrance exam. On the other hand, the community of learning, the value each child, aim for learning, and connect the children with life rather than cramming them. Because this strategy worked on the children, so teacher 19 think this strategy has expanded widely. Well, this excerpt show the effectiveness of school change strategy, but also, the teachers in South Korea refers to school reform movement from Japan because the way they feel this is effective is correlated to similarity of educational problems. So, similarity of educational problems grab their attention to how to solve this problem from the lesson from Japan. Teacher 6, he said the biggest problem of Korean public education was the uniform style classroom teaching. This is this is about Asian style of education. As I mentioned a little bit, some of you do not agree the way we defining East Asian style education, but interview data, from the interview data, I was able to interpret uniform style of education is problematic to these teachers and is causing their motive and promoting their motives to Sato Manabu's community of learning. Perception of communality. Beside the previous three characteristics that I draw with my co-author, in addition to them, I asked them how they perceive commonality between Hyukshin School and learning, community of learning in Japan. Public goods, democracy, excellence for all, which are philosophical foundation of community of learning, can also be found in South Korea's Hyukshin School movement. In particular, Hyukshin School activists are determined to continue their desire to achieve social reform through restoration of a public goods of education, through innovation of teaching at school side. What is most interesting to me when I analyze the data, the philosophy, the term philosophy is very common key words. It's a frequently used, philosophy is the vocabulary, is frequently used. So, philosophy matters in the trade of ideas for school reform in Japan and South Korea. Perception of difference. These 20 teachers are deeply involved in community of learning among Hyukshin School movements. So you might think these teachers are not everyone, but most of the teachers are members in community of learning. One aspect we need to know is Sato Manabu's PhD student, her name is Son Woo-jung Son. She has led the group of community of learning by Sato Manabu in South Korea. So these teachers are members of that group. So they are deeply involved in this community of learning. I think many of them have visited in Japan, so they are very well known about it. Teacher 11 is one of them. The biggest difference can be found in the principal's role and the teacher's attitude. The first of all, at the communitarian learning in Japan, it was the principal who proposed and led it for innovation in teaching. However, the leadership of the learning community in Korea was mainly played by teachers. In many cases, the principal cooperated by wait and see or passively. Well, I think that excerpt, tells the many things. So it is open to interpretation. One interpretation might be the way in Japan, community of learning led by like a principal or sometimes top down. Maybe I'm wrong. So just to let me know if I have the wrong information, or I think a little bit differently from your ones. But in South Korean teachers who have known very well in community of learning in Japan, they think in South Korea, in Hyukshin schools, this is applied in a way of like a bottom up. But in Japan, the principal tended to have a leadership in applying it in the each schools. The second perception of a difference, the teacher, the 15, what teacher 15 said, it sounds very interesting. Whether in Hyukshin School or in the community of learning, the philosophy and the goals are same. However, I think in Japan, the role of educational authority and the school principal is greater than that of Korea. In comparison, Hyukshin schools in Korea were built from the below and spread out another school. And I felt that progressive spirit of bringing about change in society as a whole through education was stronger than that of Japan. As we went through the background of Hyukshin School, progressive superintendents or the election of a superintendent is very, very important in promoting Hyukshin School. So, Korean Teachers Union deeply collaborate with the progressive superintendents in promoting Hyukshin schools and spreading out them. So I think some of Korean Hyukshin school teachers think Hyukshin school is much more democratic than community of learning. Well, when I read the Sato Manabu's books, he really give emphasis on democracy. So, it will be a controversial if the Hyukshin school is more democratic in spirit than the community of learning. But later, we might want to compare two school movements in theory and practice later on. This is the final pages that I brought to today discussion. The first one is motives of reference. Me and I draw three characteristics in motives of reference or borrowing or drawing lessons from the educational movement from another country or another jurisdictions. The first one is educational philosophy. Philosophy is very important. This is, not a lesson drawing at the national level. This is, collaboration and lesson drawing between the teachers level, bottom of movement. So I think in that level, educational philosophy is thought of very important to think, collaborate between two countries. Similarity of educational problems and the effectiveness is another important factors in this communication. I think the effectiveness is very important. When I analyze the data, many Hyukshin School teachers who deeply involved in community of learning found out it is very effective to change school because they started with change in classroom teaching. The classroom teaching is always crucial crucial interest for teachers because they always want to satisfy with their classroom. And then, when observing the lesson, open lesson, rather than, evaluating or making a judgment on teachers who deliver the class, they are observing every student's growth. If they are really engaged in classroom, they're engaged in their tasks, if they are really satisfied with the learning, if they are really in the track of the growth. So I think the effectiveness is very important element in this process. The second, I really want to point out the contradiction is very important. I think this is very important to know. The Hyukshin School's identity is always being constructed. Some teachers appropriate the effectiveness of community of learning, while some other teachers have given emphasis on like a relationship between education and the welfare state. They are looking at the Finnish education, the Danish education, Swedish education, because they are part of a welfare state. The other teachers in Hyukshin School have looked at like a Vygotsky pedagogical theory, because the social constructivists have focused on collaborative learning, and the learning is constructed by society. So as a progressive teachers, they are really interested in the relationship, the individual and the society. So in this tradition, contradiction is very important, because in Marxian or Marxist tradition of Vygotskian learning theory, the contradiction is the source for like a development. So teachers looked at contradiction of like a student rights, like a classroom, student alienation in classroom, corporal punishment. They are all look at those are contradictions for better, against better education. So if you don't feel any contradiction in your school, we are not able to expect any motives to change. So contradiction is very important for teachers to get started with school changes. So recently I focusing on the concept of a contradiction as a starting point for school change, which is always related to school, social democracy. I'm going to move on the next to the theme, which I call discussion without nationality. We need a collaboration and the dialogue among East Asian educators, not to mention Japan and South Korea. In East Asian countries, they share their strength and the fitful and we have a, we are very common in having some sort of educational problems and educational strength. So we have to careful not to reduce the meaning of station education to a fixed identity, but there are a lot of commonality between us. So our discussion should be shared without nationality, because as a Korean educators, I really care about children and adolescents in Japan, in China, and Singapore. So East Asian educators, have to meet, often have a dialogue, or we have to learn each other and help each other. And I think the Hyukshin School is part of education for social democracy. Without the democracy, I think any effort for school change can succeed. So we always keep in mind educational change is for the social democracy in society. And the pictures, the left, we studied research on Hyukshin School with the Boston College in in US. The team, with the team who have written about the fourth way. I just share this information because we have to perform the research between Japan and Korea, like a collaborative research. So today's presentation would contribute to get a starting point for collaborative research on school change later on. Okay, thank you for listening my lecture for a long time, and then if you have any other questions, I'm really happy to keep this dialogue.